Hi, my name is Charlotte Goodwin, and welcome to Author's Question Time. So, today's question is: which writers have inspired you? Okay, so there's lots of writers that have written books that are right behind my head, and every single one of them has inspired me. But I'm going to pick out just a few and talk about those. The first one I'm going to talk about is Tolkien. So, good old Tolkien, he's responsible for making me love fantasy, I think. So the first fantasy book I remember reading slash being read was The Hobbit, which was read to me as a class reader when I was at school. I enjoyed it so much, I went out and bought myself a copy of Lord of the Rings, and I read through that. And so, yeah, I think that's what got me into fantasy in the first place. So moving on from then, what did I read? I read a lot of Terry Pratchett. So I love sort of Terry Pratchett's humour and light-hearted approach to things. And so he's certainly inspired me to have a little bit of humour in some of my books, particularly between my military characters who do mock each other quite a lot. I've seen a lot of military banter in my time, and I enjoy writing about it. It sometimes makes me chuckle when I read my own stuff back. So Tolkien certainly introduced me to fantasy, made me love it, made me love the traditional fantasy universe, which is why I've got a traditional fantasy universe on my fantasy planet. Pratchett made me love humour, and I like to think I do put a bit of humour into my stories. Now I'm going to talk about George R.R. Martin. So Game of Thrones series, I read all of his books that he's released anyway before the series was even out, and yeah, I really enjoyed them. I do think they got a little bit waffly towards the latter books and needed a really good edit, but overall the story was really interesting. And I think the key influence for me from George R. R. Martin is the way he's got lots of different characters with lots of different threads that intertwine and mingle and create these really complex worlds. Now, I can't claim my worlds are quite as complex as George R. R. Martin's, but I do have multiple characters with multiple threads. Even though the names of my books in the Offspring trilogy suggest otherwise, there's a lot of other side characters who have got quite significant plot lines of their own. So that's George R. R. Martin. And the last author I'm going to talk about is Joe Abercrombie. So I read his first law series while I was writing my Gallantrian Legacy series. I read it quite slowly because I was writing an awful lot. But what I really liked about his series was his character development. And I think that's what he's the king of when it comes to writing. He writes really interesting characters with an awful lot of depth, and he's the master of drip feeding parts of their character backstory into the story as you go along, and making you think that these characters are really interesting and have got a lot of depth to them. Now, that's something that certainly inspired me when I've been writing my stories, because I like to think my characters are almost equally as interesting and complex to a large extent, certainly some more than others, to the extent that some of my characters I'm going to have to write whole other books about because they've got such complicated backstories in my own mind that they deserve an entire book writing about them. So that's Joe Abercrombie and his influence. And then finally, I'm going to talk about Star Wars, which isn't really a book or it's not really a written series. It's obviously a sci-fi film series, and Star Wars has influenced me in the respect of the way they've got this kind of sci-fi environment with a bit of fantasy thrown in. I've kind of done the opposite in that I've got fantasy with a bit of sci-fi thrown in, because I do love sci-fi, but I have to admit I enjoy watching it more than reading it. I've not read a lot of sci-fi, but I have watched plenty of sci-fi films, and I do quite like those elements. I like the scientific nature of it. I studied sciences at university, and I like the idea of my fantasy setting being set on some kind of scientific reality, which it is. So, yeah, if I was going to come up with a sort of outline idea for what my series is, I would suggest it might be Game of Thrones meets Star Wars. A bit more of the Game of Thrones, a bit less of the Star Wars, but we've got kind of two key elements in there. Um, that's a little bit about what's inspired me and my writing of my series. If you want to find out more, by all means, check out my website. It's charlottegoodwin.co.uk. Thanks for listening. Bye.